It was a hot Tuesday morning in Atlanta, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew. Passengers shuffled through Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, dragging suitcases, balancing coffee cups, and checking their phones every few seconds. Among them was a man in his early 40s dressed in a plain navy button-down shirt, dark slacks, and well-worn loafers. He carried no fancy luggage, just a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a printed boarding pass in his hand. He didn't look like someone important. No flashy watch, no designer sunglasses, no entourage. He blended right in with the crowd, the kind of person you'd pass without a second glance. But looks can be deceiving. The man had built something most people only dream of. Years ago, he'd started with a single leased aircraft, flying short routes between small towns that bigger airlines ignored. He believed everyone deserved safe, reliable air travel, not just those who could afford first class. Slowly, carefully, he grew his business. He reinvested every dollar, hired local crews, listened to passenger complaints, and fixed what others ignored. Now his airline operated dozens of planes across the country. He owned the majority stake, but he never forgot what it felt like to be treated like you didn't belong. That's why he flew like this, quietly, without warning, without fanfare. He wanted to see how his airline really operated when no one knew the boss was watching. He walked up to the gate just as boarding began. The lead flight attendant stood near the jet bridge, clipboard in hand, scanning tickets with a practiced eye. She was in her late 30s, sharp uniform, hair pulled back tightly, expression unreadable. As the man approached and handed her his boarding pass, first class aisle seat paid in full, she barely glanced at it. Her eyes flicked up at him, then back down, then up again, slower this time. "You sure this is yours?" she asked, voice flat. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't ask for ID, didn't check the system, didn't even look at the barcode. Instead, she gave a small, knowing smirk as if she'd caught him in a lie. "These printouts can be faked pretty easily, you know," she said, loud enough that the passengers behind him paused. Before he could respond, she tore the ticket clean in half with a quick, sharp motion. The sound cut through the hum of the gate area like a crack of thunder. She dropped the pieces on the floor near his feet. "Next time," she said coolly, "don't try to sneak into seats you didn't pay for." A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. One woman glanced away. A man in a baseball cap frowned but said nothing. The man himself didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply bent down, picked up the torn pieces, folded them neatly, and slipped them into his pocket. Then he stepped aside. He didn't argue, didn't demand to speak to a supervisor, didn't make a scene. He just walked to the back of the line, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end, a calm voice answered after one ring. "Sir, I'm at gate B14, he said quietly. "Flight 422 to Chicago. Just had my ticket destroyed by the lead flight attendant. She assumed I was trying to scam my way into first class." There was a pause. Then, "Do you want us to—" "No," he interrupted gently. "Let the flight proceed as normal. I'll take a seat in economy, but have someone meet the plane when it lands, and pull the security footage from this gate." He hung up, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and waited patiently as boarding continued. When it was his turn again, he showed his ID and the remnants of his ticket to a different attendant, this one younger, more nervous, who quickly verified his reservation on her tablet and whispered an apology before directing him to a seat in the back. As he settled into the narrow economy seat, he watched the lead flight attendant strut down the aisle, checking overhead bins with an air of authority. She hadn't even noticed he was on the plane now. She was too busy chatting with a colleague near the galley, laughing about something. From what he could hear, she was telling the story of the guy who tried to fake his way into first class. Her voice carried just enough for a few nearby passengers to catch snippets. One elderly woman turned to him and whispered, "That wasn't right what she did." He gave her a small smile. "People make assumptions," he said. "Sometimes they're wrong." She nodded, then offered to switch seats with him. "I've got an empty row back here. You can have it if you want some space." He thanked her but declined. He wanted to stay where he was, to see how the rest of the flight unfolded, to feel what an ordinary passenger felt. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. Engines roared to life. Flight attendants ran through the safety demonstration with practiced ease. The lead attendant walked the aisle one last time before takeoff, making sure seatbelts were fastened and tray tables stowed. When she passed his row, she didn't even glance his way. Outside, the Atlanta skyline shrank beneath them as the plane climbed into the sky. Clouds drifted past the window. Inside, the cabin hummed with the low murmur of conversation, the occasional baby's cry, the rustle of snack wrappers. But something was different now. A few passengers kept glancing back at him, not with suspicion but with quiet curiosity. They'd seen what happened at the gate. They'd heard the tone in the flight attendant's voice, and they'd noticed how calmly he'd handled it. No one knew who he was. Not yet, but by the time the plane touched down in Chicago, everything would change. Not just for him, but for the airline, for the crew, and for the way people thought about who belongs where. For now, though, he sat quietly watching the clouds, thinking about the long road that had brought him here, and the even longer road ahead. The plane leveled off somewhere over Tennessee, sunlight glinting off the wing as it cut through a patch of high-altitude haze. Most passengers had settled in, some dozing, others scrolling through movies on their seatback screens, a few flipping through magazines they'd grabbed at the gate. But in the back row, the man sat wide awake, eyes fixed on the cabin ahead. He wasn't watching the clouds anymore. He was watching people. The lead flight attendant moved through the aisle with practiced confidence, handing out drinks and snacks, flashing a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She hadn't looked back once since takeoff. To her, the incident at the gate was already forgotten, just another minor disruption she'd handled efficiently. She probably thought she'd done her job well, protecting first class from someone who clearly didn't belong. But the truth was spreading quietly through the cabin like a ripple. A college student 2 rows up leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Did you see what happened back there?" She just tore his ticket like he was trash. Her friend nodded, and he didn't even yell. That takes serious control. Near the front, a businessman in a wrinkled suit kept glancing toward the back, frowning slightly. He'd been in first class himself and had overheard the exchange. At first, he'd assumed the flight attendant was right. After all, fake boarding passes weren't unheard of. But the more he thought about it, the less it sat right. The man hadn't acted nervous, hadn't stammered, hadn't tried to talk his way out of it. He'd just accepted it, and that calmness felt heavier than any argument. Meanwhile, the man in economy stayed quiet. He accepted a small cup of water from a younger flight attendant who avoided eye contact, clearly nervous. She'd seen what happened too. Unlike her supervisor, she seemed unsure, maybe even ashamed. When she walked away, she glanced back once as if wanting to say something but not knowing how. About 40 minutes into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor operational issue and will be returning to Atlanta shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We apologize for the inconvenience." A murmur went through the cabin. Returning? They'd barely left Georgia airspace. The lead flight attendant froze mid-aisle, drink cart in hand. Her confident posture faltered for just a second, confusion flickering across her face before she smoothed it back into professionalism. She tapped her earpiece, listening intently, then quickly began securing the galley. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Some pulled out their phones only to find no signal at 30,000 feet. Others leaned forward, trying to catch any clue from the crew. But the man in the back didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked resigned. He leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes as if bracing for what was coming. 20 minutes later, the plane touched down smoothly back in Atlanta. No emergency lights, no urgency in the crew's movements, just a quiet, deliberate return. As the aircraft rolled to a stop at a remote gate, far from the main terminal, a hush fell over the cabin. Then through the window, people saw them. 2 men in dark suits walking briskly across the tarmac, followed by a woman in a crisp airline blazer. They weren't ground crew. They moved with purpose like executives, and they were heading straight for this plane. Inside, the lead flight attendant's hands began to shake. She tried to hide it by folding a blanket, but her movements were stiff, jerky. She kept glancing toward the cockpit, then toward the back of the plane, then at her watch as if time might somehow rewind. The jet bridge connected with a soft thud. The cabin door opened. The 3 officials stepped inside. The woman in the blazer, a senior vice president of customer experience, scanned the cabin quickly. Then her eyes locked onto the man in the last row. Her expression shifted instantly, from professional calm to something closer to dread. She walked straight to him. "Sir?" she said, voice low but urgent. "We are so sorry. We've reviewed the gate footage. We've spoken with operations. This should never have happened." He stood slowly, nodding once. "I know you didn't mean for it to," he said. "But it did," she swallowed hard. "We'd like you to come with us. There's a car waiting. We'll get you on the next available flight. First class, of course, or a private charter if you prefer." He shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere yet. I want to see how this ends." She hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Then she turned and walked toward the front of the plane. The lead flight attendant stood near the galley, arms crossed, trying to look composed. But her face had gone pale. The executive didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Step off the aircraft, please," she said quietly. "HR will meet you at the crew entrance." The flight attendant opened her mouth to protest, to explain, maybe to apologize, but no words came out. She just nodded, grabbed her bag, and walked down the jet bridge alone, head down, shoulders slumped. Back inside the cabin, passengers watched in stunned silence. No one cheered. No one laughed. There was just a heavy quiet, the kind that comes when people realize they've witnessed something real, something that cuts deeper than a simple mistake. The man turned to the elderly woman who'd offered him her seat earlier. "Thank you," he said softly, "for seeing me." She patted his arm. "Anyone with eyes could see you didn't deserve that." He smiled faintly. Then he turned to the rest of the cabin. "I appreciate everyone's patience today," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "This airline belongs to all of us, passengers, crew, everyone. And we're going to do better." A few people nodded. One clapped gently. Most just watched him, trying to piece together who he really was. He didn't announce it, didn't make a speech, but by the time he stepped off the plane, word had already started to spread. Not through headlines, but through hushed conversations, texts to friends, posts in private employee groups. The owner had been on Flight 422, and he'd been treated like a stranger in his own house. As he walked toward the waiting car, he glanced back once at the aircraft, the logo of his airline gleaming in the afternoon sun. It wasn't anger he felt. It was responsibility. Because if this could happen to him, imagine what happened to others who didn't have a private car waiting or a vice president rushing to apologize. The flight might have turned around, but his mission hadn't. In fact, it had just begun. The news didn't explode overnight. There were no viral videos, no dramatic headlines splashed across national news sites. But in the quiet corners of the airline world, employee group chats, crew lounges, internal message boards, the story moved like a slow-burning fuse. "Did you hear what happened on 422? Someone would ask in a hushed tone. And just like that, the whole thing would spill out again. How the owner himself had been standing at the gate, ticket in hand, and how one flight attendant had torn it up without a second thought. At first, many didn't believe it. No way, they'd say. He wouldn't fly coach. He wouldn't be alone. He wouldn't let that happen. But then came the confirmation. First from a gate agent who recognized him from a company town hall, then from a junior crew member who'd served him water, and later saw his photo in an old newsletter. The pieces fit, and once they did, the weight of it settled over the entire company like a thick fog. Inside the airline's headquarters, things moved fast. By the next morning, a special task force had been assembled. HR pulled the security footage from Gate B14 and reviewed it frame by frame. They interviewed every staff member who'd been on duty. They even reached out to passengers who'd been on the flight, asking, gently, respectfully, if they'd be willing to share what they saw. Most agreed. Their accounts lined up almost perfectly. The tone, the tearing of the ticket, the quiet dignity of the man who'd been wronged. The lead flight attendant was placed on administrative leave. Not fired outright. There would be a formal review, a chance to respond, but everyone knew her days with the airline were numbered. She'd made a judgment not based on policy, not on procedure, but on how someone looked. And in an industry built on trust and safety, that kind of assumption could cost more than just a job. It could cost lives if it ever happened in a real emergency. Meanwhile, the man himself stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't give interviews, didn't post anything on social media. He spent the next few days meeting quietly with his leadership team, not to assign blame, but to ask hard questions. How did this happen? How many times has it happened before? And what are we going to do so it never happens again? He remembered his early days, sleeping in airport lounges between flights, eating gas station sandwiches, getting turned away from meetings because people assumed he was the driver, not the founder. He'd built this airline not just to move people from one place to another, but to create a space where everyone, no matter their skin color, their accent, their clothes, felt seen, respected, and safe. And somewhere along the way, that promise had cracked, so he made a decision. He called for a company-wide pause, not a shutdown, but a reset. Every flight would keep running, every schedule honored, but starting the following week, all customer-facing staff would go through a new kind of training. Not the usual script about smiling more or upselling snacks, but real, honest conversations about bias, unconscious and otherwise. They'd bring in outside facilitators, former passengers who'd experienced discrimination, even psychologists who specialized in decision-making under pressure. And he added something new, a rule that no boarding pass, printed, digital or handwritten, could be invalidated on the spot without first checking the airline's live reservation system and, if there was any doubt, calling a supervisor. No more snap judgments, no more tearing up tickets like they were junk mail. But he didn't stop there. He also announced a new feedback system, one that was completely anonymous. Passengers could scan a QR code on their seatback or tray table after landing and share exactly what happened on their flight, good or bad. No names, no fear of retaliation. And every single response would be read by someone on his team, not just filed away in a database. Some executives worried it would open the floodgates to complaints. He told them, good, let them come. If we're doing something wrong, I want to know. Then, quietly, without fanfare, he set up a scholarship fund, not in his own name, but in the name of the values he believed the airline had lost sight of: dignity, fairness, opportunity. It would support young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to work in aviation, not just as pilots or flight attendants, but as engineers, dispatchers, mechanics, and managers. Because real change, he knew, didn't just happen in the air. It started on the ground long before anyone ever stepped onto a plane. Back at the airport, things were already shifting. Crew members talked more openly in the break rooms. New posters went up in staff areas, not corporate slogans, but simple reminders. Assume nothing. Verify everything. Treat everyone like they belong, because they do. One gate agent later admitted she'd almost questioned a passenger the week before for the same reason. Just didn't look like a first-class traveler. But after hearing what happened on Flight 422, she double-checked the system instead. The passenger was exactly who he said he was. She apologized anyway, just for the doubt. That was the point, the man would later say in a small internal meeting. Not perfection, but awareness. Not shame, but responsibility. He still hadn't spoken publicly about the incident. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder. And slowly, the culture inside the airline began to bend. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 small choices made by people who finally understood that respect isn't earned by a ticket. It's given freely, to everyone, every time. Outside the company, the story remained mostly quiet. But inside, it became a turning point. A moment people would later point to and say, that's when we started getting it right. Weeks passed. The Atlanta summer gave way to muggy August evenings, and life at the airline settled into a new rhythm. On the surface, things looked the same. Planes still took off on schedule. Flight attendants still handed out pretzels and pillows. Passengers still rushed through terminals with their heads down. But beneath it all, something had shifted. You could feel it in the way gate agents double-checked reservations before speaking, in the way crew members paused before making assumptions, in the quiet apologies offered not because someone complained, but because someone finally saw what they'd almost done wrong. The lead flight attendant never returned to work. After the internal review, she resigned before formal termination proceedings began. She didn't fight it. In her final statement to HR, she admitted she'd acted on instinct, not policy, and that her instinct had been clouded by something she didn't fully understand until it was too late. She applied to other airlines soon after, hoping to start fresh somewhere. No one knew her story. But the aviation world is smaller than most people think. Word travels fast among crew schedulers, hiring managers, even union reps. Her application was declined, not with a letter, not with an explanation, just a polite, We've decided to move forward with other candidates. She didn't get a second chance in the skies. Meanwhile, the man who'd been turned away at the gate kept flying, not as a CEO in a private jet, but as a passenger, sometimes in first, sometimes in coach, always watching, always listening. He didn't do it to catch people slipping up. He did it because he believed change only sticks when leaders stay close to the ground. On one flight to Denver, he watched a new flight attendant gently help an elderly man stow his bag, even though she was already behind on her service duties. On another to Miami, he saw a gate agent patiently walk a nervous first-time flyer through every step of boarding, smiling the whole time. Those moments mattered just as much as the mistakes. The anonymous feedback system started filling up, not with outrage but with small, honest notes. The crew on Flight 219 made my daughter feel safe when she got scared during turbulence. Gate agent in Charlotte double-checked my name when I mispronounced it, didn't make me feel dumb. Flight attendant assumed I couldn't afford a drink upgrade. I could, but I appreciated that she didn't push it. These weren't grand revelations, but they painted a picture of a company learning to see people as individuals, not stereotypes. Then came the scholarship announcement. It wasn't flashy. No press release, no gala event. Just a quiet post on the airline's internal newsletter and a link on their community outreach page. The program would fund full tuition for 5 students each year, Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other underrepresented young adults who dreamed of careers in aviation but faced financial or systemic barriers. Not just pilots, but dispatchers, maintenance technicians, customer experience designers, even future HR leaders who might one day help shape fairer policies. Within days, applications poured in from high schools in Detroit, community colleges in Houston, vocational programs in rural Oregon. One young woman wrote that she'd grown up near an airport, watching planes take off every evening, wondering if someone like her would ever be allowed inside the cockpit or even the control tower. Another applicant, a young man from a native reservation in New Mexico, said he wanted to bring reliable air service back to his community, where medical evacuations often took hours too long. The man read every application himself, not because he had to, but because he remembered what it felt like to be told, in 1,000 quiet ways, that the sky wasn't for you. He also made sure the selection committee included people who'd faced similar doubts. The mechanic who'd been told he didn't look like an engineer, the flight instructor who'd been passed over for years because of her accent. Their voices would help choose not just the most qualified, but the most determined. Back at headquarters, the bias training sessions began. They weren't lectures. They were conversations. Employees sat in circles, not rows. They shared stories about times they'd been misjudged, times they'd misjudged others. One veteran flight attendant admitted she'd once assumed a well-dressed black man was a celebrity's bodyguard, not the passenger himself. Another recalled how she'd spoken more slowly to an Asian elder, assuming he didn't understand English, only to learn he was a retired linguistics professor. These weren't confessions meant to shame. They were acknowledgments meant to heal, and slowly the culture changed. New hires were onboarded with a different message. Your job isn't just to serve passengers. It's to see them. Supervisors were trained to notice not just performance metrics, but moments of human connection or disconnection. Even the language in the employee handbook was updated. Instead of maintain cabin order, it now read, foster a cabin where everyone feels welcome. The man never demanded praise for any of this. He didn't want a statue or a name terminal. What he wanted was simple, that no one else would stand at a gate, ticket in hand, and be told they didn't belong, especially not on an airline he built with his own hands. One evening, as he walked through the Atlanta terminal after a late flight, a young gate agent recognized him. She didn't say anything at first, just gave a small, respectful nod. Then as he passed, she whispered, "Thank you for making us better." He stopped, turned, and met her eyes. "You're the one doing the work," he said. "I just reminded you why it matters," she smiled. And in that moment he knew the real repair had begun, not in boardrooms or policy manuals, but in the quiet choices people made every day, one passenger at a time. It had been nearly a year since that hot morning in Atlanta, and the man was back at the same gate, Gate B14, though no one recognized him this time. He wore a faded baseball cap, a soft cotton jacket, and carried the same worn duffel. His boarding pass was digital now, pulled up on his phone, but he held it loosely like it was just another part of the routine. He didn't look around for cameras or executives. He wasn't here to inspect. He was here to fly. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Families wrangling kids, business travelers typing furiously, couples sharing earbuds and quiet laughs. A new lead flight attendant stood by the jet bridge, clipboard in hand, but her posture was different. She made eye contact. She smiled, not the tight performative kind, but a real one, warm and unhurried. When a young boy dropped his stuffed dinosaur near the boarding line, she bent down, picked it up, and handed it back with a gentle, "Looks like he's ready for takeoff too." The man watched, silent. No tearing, no assumptions. Just kindness offered without condition. He boarded the plane and took his seat, again in economy, again near the back. As the cabin filled, he noticed small things. The way the flight attendants greeted each passenger by name when they checked IDs. How they asked, "Is this your first time flying with us?" Not as a sales pitch, but as a genuine question. How they paused when someone looked confused, offering help without making them feel small. Midway through the flight, a woman a few rows ahead started crying quietly. Soft, muffled sobs she tried to hide behind her hand. Within seconds, a flight attendant was beside her, crouching low so they were eye to eye. "Hey," she said softly, "you okay?" No rush, no performance, just presence. The woman nodded, wiped her eyes, and whispered something. The attendant stayed for a full minute, then returned with a cup of tea and a blanket, tucking it around her shoulders like she was family. No one filmed it. No one posted about it, but the man saw it. And it meant more than any press release ever could. Later, as the plane descended into Chicago, sunlight spilling through the windows in golden streaks, he thought about how change doesn't roar, it whispers. It's not in grand speeches or viral moments, but in the 1,000 tiny choices people make when no one's watching. The choice to verify instead of assume, to listen instead of judge, to see a person, not a stereotype. Back on the ground, the scholarship program was already bearing fruit. The first 5 recipients had started their training, 2 in aviation maintenance schools, 1 in air traffic control, another studying aerospace engineering, and the last enrolled in a customer experience design program focused on inclusive travel. They'd met the man once over a quiet lunch, not as a CEO, but as someone who'd once stood where they stood. Hopeful, underestimated, determined. He didn't promise them easy paths. He told them it would still be hard. People would still doubt them. Doors would still slam. But now at least there was a key, and a growing group of people inside holding the door open. Inside the airline, the anonymous feedback system had become a trusted tool. Not for punishment, but for learning. Managers reviewed notes weekly, not to find fault, but to spot patterns where training was working, where more support was needed. One route had consistently low scores on feeling respected during delays. So they retrained the ground crew there, focusing on clear communication and empathy. Within 2 months, scores jumped. Even the flight attendants began using the system themselves, submitting notes like, "Passenger in 14B seemed anxious but didn't ask for help. Maybe we could offer calm kits?" That idea became real. Small pouches with earplugs, a stress ball, a note that read, "You're safe. We've got you." The man never sought credit for any of it. In fact, he rarely mentioned the incident at Gate B14 anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because it had already done its work. It had cracked something open, and through that crack, light had gotten in. One evening, months later, he sat in a small airport diner near his home, eating a late dinner after a red-eye. A woman in a flight attendant's uniform slid into the booth across from him. She looked tired but calm. She didn't say anything at first, just stirred her coffee, then looked up. "I was on that flight," she said quietly. "The one that turned around?" He nodded. "I remember you. You gave me water." She smiled faintly. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not just for what happened, but for how long it took me to really understand why it mattered." He leaned forward. "You're here now. That's what counts." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I tell new hires about it, not to scare them, but to remind them. We don't just move bodies from place to place. We hold space for people's lives, even if just for a few hours." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then softly, "That's exactly it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people bound by a moment neither had planned but both had grown from. As he walked back to his car that night, the sky was clear, stars scattered like scattered salt. He thought about all the people who'd flown with his airline since that day in Atlanta. Millions of them, each with their own story, their own worries, their own hopes. And he hoped more than anything that every single one of them had felt seen. The story never made national news. There were no documentaries, no courtroom dramas, no fiery resignations. But in the quiet corners of an industry that moves the world, it became a quiet legend. A reminder that power isn't always in the title you hold, but in the respect you give. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stand still, pick up the pieces of a torn ticket and choose to respond with grace instead of rage. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove home. Just another man in a baseball cap, disappearing into the night. But somewhere above, a plane was taking off, full of people who finally felt like they belonged. And that was enough. It had been over a year since that morning in Atlanta, and the story that began with a torn ticket had quietly woven itself into the fabric of the airline, not as a scandal, but as a turning point. Most passengers flying today had no idea it ever happened. They just noticed, maybe without even realizing it, that the crew seemed a little kinder, the boarding process a little smoother, the whole experience a little more human. That was the real victory. When change becomes so ordinary, people forget it was ever different. But for those who were there, the memory lingered not as shame, but as a compass. One rainy afternoon in Chicago, a young woman stood at a gate, clutching her first ever first-class boarding pass. She'd saved for months for this trip, a reward to herself after finishing nursing school. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the jet bridge. She'd heard stories about people being questioned, moved, even humiliated, just because they didn't look like first-class passengers. She braced herself. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and calm eyes, took her pass, scanned it, then looked up and smiled. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "First time in the front cabin?" The young woman blinked, surprised. "Yes, is it that obvious?" "Not at all," the attendant said, handing back the pass. "But I remember my first time too. Felt like I was walking into someone else's party. You belong here just as much as anyone." The young woman's shoulders relaxed. She walked down the aisle not with swagger, but with quiet dignity, exactly as she should. That moment, small as it was the echo of everything that had changed. Back at headquarters, the scholarship program had grown. What started with 5 students now supported 20, with partnerships forming with community colleges and technical schools across the country. One recipient, a young man from rural Mississippi, had just completed his first solo flight as a student pilot. Another, a woman from the Bronx, was interning in the airline's operations center, tracking weather patterns and rerouting flights during storms. They weren't just learning skills, they were becoming the next generation of leaders who would carry the lesson forward. That excellence has no face, no accent, no zip code. The man who started it all still flew regularly, though less incognito now, not because he wanted attention, but because people began recognizing him, not from photos, but from the way he listened. He'd sit and coach and talk to passengers about their trips, their jobs, their kids. He once spent an entire flight helping an elderly man write a letter to his granddaughter. Another time, he quietly paid for a stranded family's hotel after a canceled connection. He never mentioned it, but word spread anyway, because kindness, like bias, is contagious. Inside the company, the anonymous feedback system had evolved into something even more powerful. It wasn't just for complaints anymore. Passengers started using it to say thank you. The crew stayed late to help my mom with her oxygen tank. Gate. Agent ran back to get my daughter's stuffed bunny she left behind. Flight attendant noticed I was scared of flying and checked on me every 20 minutes. These notes were printed and posted in crew break rooms, not as performance metrics, but as reminders of why the work mattered. Even the training had deepened. New hires now spent a full day not in a classroom, but shadowing gate agents, baggage handlers, and customer service reps, the people who rarely got seen but kept everything running. They learned that respect wasn't just for the cabin. It started the moment someone walked into the terminal. And the policy about verifying tickets? It became standard across the entire industry, after a few other airlines quietly adopted similar rules, inspired not by headlines, but by word of mouth. The practice of tearing up a ticket on suspicion alone faded into the past, like smoking sections and overhead projectors. But the most surprising shift happened in the crew themselves. Flight attendants began mentoring each other, not just on safety procedures, but on emotional awareness. One veteran crew member started a monthly listening circle, where staff could share moments they'd gotten wrong, or right. No managers, no notes, just honesty. In one session, a young attendant admitted he'd almost asked a black man to move from a premium seat because he looked like he was in the wrong place. But then he remembered the story of Flight 2 and checked the system instead. The passenger was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I almost made the same mistake," the attendant said, voice shaking. "But I caught myself. And that's because someone before me paid the price so I wouldn't have to." That was the legacy, not punishment, but prevention. Not shame, but shared responsibility. One spring morning, the man received a letter. It wasn't from a passenger or an employee. It was from a retired school teacher in Georgia. She wrote that she'd been on Flight 422 that day. She'd watched the whole thing unfold from her seat near the front. She'd wanted to speak up but didn't, out of fear or maybe just habit. For months, she carried guilt. Then she read about the changes the airline was making. She wrote to say thank you, not for fixing a policy, but for giving her the courage to speak up the next time she saw something unfair. Just last week, she'd intervened when a store clerk accused a teenager of stealing. "You reminded me," she wrote, "that silence is its own kind of tearing." He read that letter 3 times. Then he framed it and hung it in his office, not near his awards or degrees, but right by his desk where he'd see it every day. The story never became a movie. There were no hashtags, no trending challenges, no celebrity endorsements. And that was fine. Real change rarely needs a spotlight. It thrives in the quiet, in a gate agent double-checking a name, in a flight attendant kneeling to talk to a child, in a passenger feeling safe enough to cry. Years later, long after the man had stepped back from day-to-day operations, a new CEO would stand before employees on the company's anniversary and say, "We don't just fly planes. We protect dignity." And everyone in the room would know exactly what she meant, because the truth is, an airline isn't made of metal and fuel. It's made of people, those who board and those who welcome them. And when both are treated with equal respect, the sky doesn't just open up, it becomes home. On a quiet evening not long ago, the man sat on a park bench near his house, watching planes trace white lines across the twilight sky. A little girl ran past, pointing upward. "Look, Daddy. That one's going to Grandma's," he smiled. Somewhere up there, someone was heading home or to a new job or a reunion or a fresh start. And on that plane, someone was making sure they felt like they belonged. No questions asked, no tickets torn, no doubts cast. That was enough. More than enough. And as the last light faded, he stood, brushed off his jacket, and walked home, not as an owner, not as a hero, but as a man who'd learned that the most powerful thing you can build isn't a company, but a culture where everyone gets to keep their ticket whole.